Hey everyone, welcome to a deep dive that's particularly for folks in the crane world.
Oh,
So safety pros, operators, if you're working towards that crane operator license, this is for you.
excellent.
And today we're presented by Safety One Source, and they've given us like this whole stack of OSHA stuff all about hoisting personnel with cranes.
Okay.
So we got, standards, interpretations, letters, clarifying little points, the whole 9 yards.
Well, that sounds comprehensive.
Yeah, and it's a topic that you think would be simple, right? Like a crane lifts things, why not people? But when you dig into these OSHA documents, there's a whole philosophy there about when it's allowed and how it's got to be done if it's as the safest way.
Right, because it's not just a matter of like, oh, let's just throw them in a bucket and lift them up, right? We have to make sure it's the least hazardous option.
Yeah, so that's interesting right off the bat. It's not just convenience, it's like a whole assessment before you even think crane for lifting people.
Absolutely, yeah. OSHA standard 1926.1431A makes that very clear. You can't use a crane to hoist personnel unless you've considered all the conventional methods like scaffolds, aerial lifts, and determined that they're either not going to work or they're actually more dangerous.
And you got to document that too, right?
Yeah.
It's not just like, yeah, we thought about it.
Oh, absolutely. Documentation is key. You need to be able to demonstrate that you've thoroughly evaluated all the options and that using a crane is truly the safest way to go.
So listeners out there, if you're in a spot where using a crane to lift people seems like the only way, make sure you've gone through all those other possibilities first and written it all down, CYA.
Exactly. Always cover yourself.
Now, let's say we've done our due diligence. We've decided, all right, crane IS, the safest way to get people where they need to be. What are we talking about safety-wise?
Well, first things first, you can't just throw them in a regular work bucket.
Right, of course not.
OSHA has specific requirements for personnel platforms, which are specially designed for hoisting people.
Okay, so special platforms. What makes them so special? This is 1926.1431B, right?
That's the one, and it gets really specific. First off, these platforms got to be designed by a qualified person, someone who knows the stresses and forces involved. They need to be level, like meticulously level, no more than a 1% grade variance.
Wow, that's pretty strict.
It is. And then the weight capacity, you ready for this? 5 times the intended load, minimum.
5 times?
Yeah.
Seems like a lot, doesn't it?
It might sound like overkill, but when you're talking about lifting people high into the air, you don't want to mess around. You've got the platform's weight, the workers, their tools, materials. Then you add in dynamic forces from movement, wind gusts. It all adds up.
So that 5X factor is about ensuring the platform doesn't, buckle under pressure.
Exactly. It's all about that extra margin of safety. There have been too many incidents where equipment failure led to tragedy, so these regulations are built on those hard lessons.
Right, makes sense. So it's not arbitrary. It's like, okay, this is based on what's gone wrong before. So weight aside, what else makes these platforms different?
Think of it like this. The platform is their temporary workspace up in the air. So it needs to be as safe as any other work area. We're talking guardrails that meet those subpart M standards, enclosed sides, grab rails for stability, even inward opening doors to prevent someone falling out during a lift.
Inward opening doors, huh? That's a detail I wouldn't have thought of.
It's the little things that make a difference. Imagine a door swinging out during a lift. Someone could easily get knocked right out.
Yeah, okay, that makes sense. So OSHA's thought of pretty much everything. We've got our platform all checked out.
Yeah.
What about the crane itself? Are there specific rules for that too?
Absolutely. You can't just grab any old crane. We got to make sure it's up to the task, right?
Yeah.
And this is where OSHA standard 1926.1431 C and D comes in. It's all about the equipment and rigging used for personnel hoisting.
Okay, break it down for me. What are the main things we got to think about when it comes to the crane?
Stability is number one. Got to make sure that crane is solid on the ground, won't tip over, especially with the platform moving around. So proper outrigger extension is key. Then there's the load capacity limit. And get this, for hoisting people, it's reduced to 50% of the crane's rated capacity.
Wait, you cut the crane's power in half?
50%, yep. Again, it's all about that safety margin. When it's human lives on the line, you don't want to push the equipment anywhere near its limits. And of course, we need to make sure those brakes are fully engaged anytime the platform is stationary. No accidental slips.
Man, it's amazing how much thought goes into this. It's not as simple as I thought it would be.
Not at all. And we haven't even mentioned the required safety devices yet. We're talking boom angle indicators, anti-tube blocking systems, controlled load-lowering mechanisms, all essential for personnel hoisting.
Okay, let's talk about those safety devices. What exactly do they do, and why are they so important?
All right, well, the boom angle indicator that tells the operator, what angle the burn's at, which is crucial for stability, preventing tip overs. Then you've got the anti-two blocking system, and this one's really important because it prevents a situation where the load block, which is carrying the platform, comes into contact with the boom tip.
And why is that so bad?
Because that contact can actually cause the hoist rope to snap, sending the whole platform plummeting down.
Oh, wow. Yeah, that's not good.
Not good at all. So these anti-two blocking systems are like lifesavers. They add that extra layer of protection to make sure the rope doesn't get overwound and create that dangerous two blocking situation.
Okay, makes sense. So we got our platform, we got our crane, all the safety gadgets. Are we ready to start lifting people now?
Not quite yet. Before we put anyone in that platform, there are two key steps we need to take: trial lifts and inspections.
Trial lifts and inspections. All right. Tell me more about those.
A trial lift, as outlined in OSHA Standard 1926.1431H, is basically like a dress rehearsal for the real thing. It involves lifting the platform, unoccupied, but loaded with at least the weight we expect the workers and their equipment to add to every location they'll be working at.
So it's a test run to make sure everything's working right.
Exactly. And it's not just a one-time thing. A trial lift is required before every shift. And again, if the crane gets moved or the lift route changes.
Why so many trial lifts? Wouldn't one at the beginning of the project be enough?
Well, things change, right? The crane might have been moved, the lift route could be different, or something could have happened overnight that affects the lift's safety. It's all about reducing risk, especially when people's lives are at stake.
Got it. So like a pre-flight check for a plane, you wouldn't just take off without making sure everything's working.
Exactly. And then right after each trial lift, and again, before every time we lift people, a competent person, someone who knows what to look for, has to do a thorough visual inspection of everything.
Okay, so what are they looking for during these inspections? Give me the rundown.
We're checking for any defects, damage, anything that could compromise the lift's safety. Are the hoist ropes in good condition? Are the multiple part lines twisted around each other, which could weaken the rope? Is the primary attachment centered over the platform for balance? It's got to be a meticulous process because we're trying to catch problems before they become dangerous.
Wow, so many checks and balances. Okay, so trial lifts are done, inspections are done, everything looks good. Can we start lifting people now?
Almost. There's one more step. Proof testing, as required by OSHA Standard 1926.1431J.
Proof testing, what's that all about?
This one goes beyond the trial lift by really pushing the limits. We test the platform and rigging at 125% of the rated capacity. Think of it like a stress test to find any hidden weaknesses.
So you're deliberately overloading it. Isn't that kind of dangerous?
It might seem that way, but it's all about making sure the platform and rigging can handle more than they'll ever have to during a regular lift. It's like a stress test for a bridge before you open it to traffic.
Okay, I get it. So how do you actually do a proof test?
We load up the platform with that test weight, that 125% we talked about, and then lower it using the controlled load lowering mechanism. Once it's hanging there, we hold it for at least 5 minutes with the weight evenly distributed.
5 minutes? That seems like a long time to be hanging there overloaded.
It is, but it gives any potential issues time to show themselves. Then, after those 5 minutes, another inspection is done by a competent person, looking for any signs of stress or anything that suggests the platform or rigging might not be as strong as they need to be.
All right, so it's like a final exam before we give the green light to start hoisting people.
Exactly. And if it doesn't pass, it's back to the drawing board until it does. Only then can we think about putting people in that platform.
Man, OSHA's really thought this through, huh?
Oh, absolutely. But we've only just scratched the surface. There are still specific rules about what you can and can't do during the lift, how weather affects things, and then that whole issue of fall protection.
Yeah, I bet there's a lot more to it than people realize.
You got that right. But we'll get into all those details in our next deep dive, so stay tuned.
All right, welcome back to our deep dive into all these OSHA regs for hoisting personnel. We're still a Safety One source, and as always, this is really geared towards the folks who live and breathe cranes, safety professionals, the operators themselves, and anyone studying to get that license.
And we really dug deep last time, right? We talked about why using a crane to lift people is that last resort option, all those crazy specific requirements for those personnel platforms, and the checks and balances like trial lifts and proof testing. But OSHA doesn't just stop there.
Yeah, because work sites aren't exactly cookie cutter, right? So today we're getting into the nitty-gritty of those specialized situations where hoisting personnel gets even more, well, let's say interesting. Think drill shafts, pile driving, the stuff that makes you really earn that paycheck.
And it's in these specific situations that you can really see OSHA's thought process. It's not just about blindly following rules, it's about adapting those safety principles to those very specific hazards you're going to encounter in those environments. So, let's start with drill shafts, those deep, often narrow excavations you got to get workers into. Standard 1926.1431 is our guide here.
Yeah, drill shafts. I can imagine getting workers in and out of those presents some unique challenges.
Yeah.
Is it just a matter of using a smaller personnel platform?
Well, sometimes, yeah, a platform can work if the shaft is, say, up to 8 feet in diameter. But what I find really interesting is that OSHA also allows for a more, shall we say, classic approach, the bosun's chair.
A bosun's chair. Sounds a little piratey, doesn't it?
It might sound a bit old school, but in certain situations, it's actually the most practical and safe way to lower a worker into a really confined space like a drill shaft. It's basically a seat or sling suspended from a single point.
Okay, so I'm picturing a sturdy seat dangling from a rope. Not exactly my idea of a comfortable ride, but I guess when you got to get to the bottom of a drill shaft, you got to do what you got to do, right?
Exactly. And OSHA recognizes that while it might not be the most high-tech solution out there, it can be effective if it's done correctly. But of course, there are some strict safety rules that come with it. You need a dedicated signal person up at the shaft opening, guiding the crane operator and constantly communicating with the worker down in the chair.
So communication is even more crucial in this scenario.
Yeah.
I mean, the worker's basically hanging in midair, right? They don't have a lot of room to maneuver.
Exactly. That signal person becomes the worker's lifeline, making sure the crane movements are precise and safe. And speaking of safety, the worker in the bosun's chair has to wear a full-body harness and a personal fall arrest system, and it has to be attached independently of the crane itself.
So even though they're in a chair, they've got that extra backup in case something goes wrong with the hoisting system.
Exactly. Redundancy is key. And the chair itself has to meet those same strength requirements we talked about before, at least 5 times the maximum intended load. OSHA doesn't mess around when it comes to personnel safety, no matter what equipment you're using.
Okay, so drill shafts and the interesting bosun's chair. What's next on our list of these kind of unusual situations?
Let's move on to another environment that can be pretty challenging. Pile driving. This is where you've got those massive hammers meeting those equally massive piles, and hoisting personnel safely becomes a real balancing act.
Pile driving, yeah. I can only imagine the forces and vibrations involved there. I bet that makes things pretty tricky for hoisting personnel. What's OSHA's take on that?
Well, standard 1926.1431P lays it all out for us, the specific requirements for pile driving. And you'll notice a familiar theme here. You can use either a personnel platform or a bosun's chair, depending on the specifics of the job.
So same players, different playing field.
That's a great way to put it. The hazards and risks associated with pile driving are definitely different from those in drill shafts, so OSHA has tailored the regulations to address those differences.
Okay, let's get into those tailored regulations then. What really stands out as unique to pile driving operations?
One of the biggest differences is how OSHA handles the risk of tube blocking. Remember, that's that dangerous situation where the load block comes into contact with the boom tip, which can cause the hoist rope to fail.
Yeah, we talked about that earlier and how anti-tube blocking systems are generally required for personnel hoisting. But you're saying pile driving is a bit different.
It is. If you're using a lattice boom crane, OSHA gives you some flexibility. You can either use an anti-tube blocking device, just like in other scenarios, or you can use a clearly marked cable and a dedicated spotter who's in constant communication with the crane operator.
So it's about providing alternative methods of protection, ones that make sense for the specific challenges of pile driving.
Exactly. And if you're using a telescopic boom crane, both the marked cable and the spotter are required. It's an added layer of safety in a situation where precision and communication are absolutely crucial.
It's really interesting how OSHA takes this nuanced approach. They recognize that a one-size-fits-all solution isn't always the best way to go when it comes to safety.
I agree. And that adaptability is essential when you're dealing with something as complex and ever-changing as construction.
Okay, so we've covered drill shafts, pile driving. Where to next on our tour of these specialized hoisting situations?
Let's head out to sea for this one. Our next stop is marine transfer, which falls under OSHA Standard 1926.1431R. We're talking about transferring workers to and from marine work sites, think barges, platforms, even ships.
Marine transfer. Okay, so we're talking about hoisting personnel onto ships or something like that.
You got it. And just like with the other situations we talked about, OSHA really emphasizes that this type of hoisting should only be done when it's absolutely necessary. If there are safer, more conventional ways to transfer personnel, those should always be explored first.
So it's a last resort only when the other options are off the table.
Right, and when marine transfer is the only viable option, OSHA lays out specific guidance on how to do it safely. And once again, you have a couple of choices: a personnel platform or a specialized device called a marine hoisted personnel transfer device.
A marine hoisted personnel transfer device. That's a mouthful. Is that just a fancy name for a bosun's chair?
Not quite. A bosun's chair is mainly designed for vertical movement, while a marine hoisted personnel transfer device is specifically made for that horizontal transfer over water. It's typically a more robust, more stable platform, often enclosed to protect from the elements.
So like a mini ferry for workers.
Yeah, that's a great analogy. And just like with any personnel hoisting operation, there are strict requirements for these devices. Got to be designed by a qualified person, sufficient weight capacity, rigged and operated according to OSHA standards, the whole 9 yards.
Okay, I'm getting the picture. Anything else that really stands out about these marine transfer operations?
Here's a detail that might seem obvious, but it's worth emphasizing. Life vests. Every single worker involved in marine transfer has to wear a U.S. Coast Guard approved personal flotation device, even if they're in a seemingly safe device.
So even with all those precautions, you still need that extra layer of protection just in case something goes wrong.
Exactly. When the consequences of a fall could be fatal, you can never be too careful.
All right, we've covered drill shafts, pile driving. We even went out to sea with marine transfer. What else is on our list of these specialized scenarios?
Our final stop takes us to the world of storage tanks, shafts, and chimneys. These are confined, often hazardous environments that present their own unique set of challenges when it comes to hoisting personnel.
Yeah, those sound like some tough places to work, let alone get hoisted into. What does OSHA have to say about keeping people safe in those environments?
Well, Standard 1926.1431s is our guide here, outlining the requirements for these specific situations. And again, we see our familiar options: personnel platform or bosun's chair. But there's a slight twist this time. Using a platform is actually the preferred method in these scenarios.
So the bosun's chair is only allowed if a platform just won't work.
That's right, because storage tanks, shafts, and chimneys often have limited access points and tight spaces inside. Using a bosun's chair might be the only way to get workers where they need to be. But it's definitely considered a less desirable option from a safety perspective.
I'm sensing a theme here. Platforms are always the go-to, with bosun's chairs only coming into play when absolutely necessary.
You're spot on. It all comes down to providing the safest, most stable working environment for those being hoisted. And platforms just offer a higher level of stability and protection compared to a chair hanging from a single point.
Makes sense. So what are some things to keep in mind when you do have to use a bosun's chair in these confined spaces, when it's the only option?
Well, just like in the other situations, slow and controlled movement is key. The worker needs to be hoisted in a smooth, steady manner, minimizing any swaying or jerky motions that could make them feel uneasy or even destabilize the chair.
I'm guessing fall protection is still a must-have, even in these tight spaces.
Absolutely. No compromises there. The worker still needs to be wearing a full body harness and a personal fall arrest system. But here's an interesting twist that's specific to these environments. If there's no suitable structure inside the confined space to attach the fall arrest system, you can actually anchor it to the lower load block or overhaul ball of the crane.
So they're basically tethered to the crane itself.
Exactly. It's a unique solution for those situations where a traditional anchor point just isn't available, and it really highlights OSHA's commitment to finding practical solutions that don't compromise safety.
Okay, so we've covered a whole range of these specialized hoisting scenarios, from drill shafts to storage tanks. It's clear that OSHA has put a lot of thought into tailoring those safety regulations to the specific challenges of each environment.
You got that right. It's a great reminder that safety isn't about blindly following a list of rules. It's about understanding the why behind those rules and applying them in a way that makes sense for the situation to ensure the safest possible outcome for everyone involved.
Well said. But I have a feeling we're not quite done with our deep dive yet. There's still more to unpack when it comes to the complexities of hoisting personnel.
You're absolutely right. We still need to talk about some crucial aspects of personnel hoisting that apply no matter the situation. Things like work practices during the actual lift, how to handle weather considerations, and of course, that always interesting topic of fall protection.
Sounds like we've got a lot more ground to cover.
We do, but we'll break it all down for you in our next deep dive, so stay tuned.
All right, welcome back to the deep dive brought to you by Safety One Source. We've been really digging into these OSHA regs for hoisting personnel, something super important for anyone working with cranes, right? Our safety folks, the operators out there, and anyone studying for that crane operator license.
Yeah, this has been a deep dive in every sense of the word. We started with those general principles, then got into those really specific scenarios where things get, a little more hairy. And what's really stood out to me is how OSHA manages to be both incredibly detailed and yet flexible enough to adapt to all the different challenges you might face on a job site.
Absolutely. And before we wrap up, we got to talk about some key things that apply across the board, no matter what specific hoisting scenario you're dealing with. We've touched on it briefly, but let's really dive into those work practices during the lift, how weather plays a role, and of course, everyone's favorite, fall protection.
Okay, good plan. Let's start with those work practices. OSHA Standard 1926.1431K gives us a whole list of rules for how the actual hoisting operation should be done. It's all about making sure that lift is smooth, controlled, predictable, minimizing any risks to the people in that platform.
Okay, so paint me a picture. What does a safe OSHA-compliant personnel hoist look like? What are some key things we got to keep in mind during that actual lift?
Well, first and foremost, no sudden movements. Lifting that platform should be slow, deliberate, controlled. Think ballet, not a roller coaster.
So no swinging it around like a wrecking ball, huh?
Definitely not. Those sudden moves can really destabilize the platform, put a lot of stress on the rigging, and someone inside could lose their balance, get hurt. Got to keep that motion smooth and predictable the whole time.
Right, makes sense. And I'm guessing the workers inside the platform have their own set of rules to follow, too. What does OSHA say about that?
Absolutely they do. OSHA says everyone in that platform has to keep all their body parts inside during the whole lift, whether it's going up, down, or moving sideways. Sounds like common sense, but you'd be surprised how easy it is to forget when you're trying to adjust something or get a better look at what you're working on.
Yeah, I can see how it would be tempting to just lean out a bit.
Yeah.
But OSHA's drawing a hard line there. No exceptions.
Well, almost. There are exceptions for folks who need to position the platform or if they're acting as the signal person, guiding the crane operator. But even then, those movements should be kept to a minimum, and you got to be super careful. Safety always comes first.
It's like a reminder that even if you've done something 1,000 times, you can't get complacent. Every lift's different. Got to be paying attention to safety every single time.
Exactly. Now, what about those times when the platform needs to stop somewhere, but it can't be fully landed? Like maybe they're working on a building or inspecting a bridge.
Right, so it's just kind of hanging there in midair.
Right.
What do we do then?
Okay, so OSHA Standard 1926.1431K3 kits in here. It says that platform has to be secured to the structure where they're working unless that would actually create a bigger hazard. Think of it like putting on your parking brake when you stop on a hill.
So tying off the platform is like the parking brake for a crane lift. I like that. But you said there might be times when securing it would be more dangerous. What would that look like?
Sure. Imagine you're working on something that's not stable. Maybe it's prone to movement. If you secure the platform to that and then the structure shifts, you could actually pull the platform over or tip it. So sometimes it's safer to keep it freely suspended and rely on the crane operator's skill to hold it in place.
Okay, so it's not always a simple answer. You got to use your judgment, assess the risks, and make the call that's going to keep everyone safe.
You got it. And that's why having that competent person on site is so crucial. They're the ones with the experience to look at a situation and say, all right, this is the safest way to do this.
Right, that makes sense. So what about the crane operator? What's their role in all of this, especially when the platform is just suspended like that?
The crane operator is absolutely critical during the whole lift, but even more so when the platform's just hanging there. They have to be super focused, watching the platform's position, responding to signals, and making those tiny adjustments to keep everything stable and safe.
So they're like the pilot, keeping that platform steady and on course.
Exactly. And just like a pilot, they need good communication with their crew up in the platform. That's where taglines come in.
Taglines, right. Remind me what those are again.
So taglines are ropes attached to the platform, used to help control its movement, especially when it's windy. They can help keep it from swaying too much or bumping into the structure.
Gotcha. So they're kind of like reins, helping guide the platform and keep it under control.
That's a good way to put it. And sometimes the platform itself might even have its own controls, so the worker inside can actually move it around themselves.
Oh, wow. That's pretty high tech.
Yeah.
Did that change the crane operator's job at all?
It does, but even if the platform has its own controls, the crane operator still has to be at the controls for the crane's boom and swing functions. And they got to be on site, within view of the equipment, ready to step in if anything goes wrong.
So even with those fancy platform controls, it's still a team effort. Everyone's got to be communicating and working together to make sure the lift is safe.
Exactly right. Now, let's talk about something we can't control but can definitely mess things up: the weather.
Ah, yes. Weather, the great unknown in any outdoor operation. How does OSHA deal with that when it comes to personnel hoisting?
Okay, so standard 1926.1431K is pretty clear. If the wind speed at the platform is over 20 mph, someone qualified has to stop and assess if it's safe to continue. And it's not just wind we're worried about. Any kind of hazardous weather, thunderstorms, heavy snow, even extreme heat, someone's got to make the call.
Because safety always comes before deadlines, right?
Absolutely. You can't put a price on people's lives.
All right, so we've talked about work practices, we've talked about weather. It seems like we've covered pretty much everything, except for one big one, and I think it's on everyone's mind when we're talking about lifting people way up high.
You're talking about fall protection, right?
Get in my mind. It seems like fall protection would just be a given in any personnel hoisting situation. So what's OSHA's stance on that?
You're right. Fall protection is huge ED. And OSHA standard 1926.1431K gets into all the details. But here's where things get interesting, maybe even a little controversial.
Oh, I do love a good controversy. Give it to me.
So while you usually need those personal fall arrest systems, harnesses and lanyards for personnel platforms, there's actually an exception when you're working over water.
Wait, hold on. No fall protection over water? That doesn't sound right. Wouldn't you want that extra safety measure in case someone falls out of the platform?
I know, it seems counterintuitive. But OSHA standard 1926.106, which is all about working over or near water, points out a very real danger: drowning. If a worker falls into the water while tied off to the platform, that fall arrest system could actually keep them from coming back up to the surface.
So the thing that's supposed to save them in most situations could actually make things worse if they're over water.
Exactly. It's a tough call, and it comes down to weighing the different risks. OSHA's even issued letters about similar situations with aerial lifts, saying it's a minor violation if workers unhook their lanyards while working over water, as long as they're wearing a harness, lanyard, and a life vest.
So it's like, okay, a life vest is going to do more good than a fall arrest system in this specific case.
Yeah.
But I bet there are a lot of folks who disagree with that approach.
Oh, absolutely. It's a debate for sure. And it shows how safety isn't always black and white. Sometimes you got to understand the reasoning behind the rules and make the call that's going to keep those workers as safe as possible, no matter what.
Well said. Man, we've covered a lot of ground today, from the basics of personnel hoisting to all those specialized situations, and even those tricky questions about fall protection. It's clear that OSHA has put a ton of work into coming up with these regulations, but it's on U.S., the safety pros, the operators, the folks learning the ropes to make sure we understand it all and put it into practice.
Couldn't agree more. And remember, Safety One Source is there to help. Their website's got tons of info on crane safety and OSHA compliance. Definitely worth checking out.
All right, as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave our listeners with something to think about. As technology keeps getting better, how do you see these regulations changing? Will new tech make personnel hoisting even safer? What do you think?
It's an exciting time to be in this field for sure. I think we're going to see some amazing innovations in the years to come. But no matter how much tech we have, it always comes back to those basic principles of safety. Careful planning, paying attention to detail, and never forgetting that we're doing this to protect people's lives.
Absolutely well said. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the world of OSHA regulations for hoisting personnel. Stay safe out there, everyone.